I'm a farmer who survived the first 12 hours of the alien invasion, and this is my story. Before I begin, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. It was 4:37 a.m. when it happened. I remember checking my watch when the power flickered across the farmhouse, interrupting my early morning routine. I'd been up since 3:30, same as every day for the past 28 years. The rhythm of farm life doesn't allow for lazy mornings or hitting the snooze button. The animals need feeding, whether you feel like it or not, and the spring planting waits for no man, especially not in Nebraska, where the growing season gives you exactly one shot to get it right. I'm Everett Holcomb, third-generation owner of Whispering Pines Farm, 380 acres of prime agricultural land that's been in my family since my grandfather bought it in 1939. I've seen droughts that cracked the earth like shattered pottery, tornadoes that picked up tractors like toys, and floods that turned fields into lakes overnight. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on that Tuesday morning in April. The power had been acting up for 3 days. Rural power grid problems aren't uncommon, but this was different. Lights would dim, then brighten to an almost blinding intensity. Electronic equipment would turn on by itself in the middle of the night. My wireless internet would connect and disconnect randomly, and when it worked, it was either impossibly fast or frustratingly slow. I was in the kitchen pouring my first cup of coffee when the flickering started again. The old farmhouse lights dimmed, brightened, then went out completely. I muttered a curse, fumbling for the flashlight I'd taken to keeping on the counter. But before I could find it, a strange blue-green glow began filtering through the windows, growing brighter with each passing second. My first thought was a transformer explosion, but this light was steady, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. I moved to the window above the sink, coffee forgotten, and looked out toward the eastern sky, where the strange illumination seemed to originate. What I saw made me drop my mug, barely registering the hot splash across my work boots or the shattering ceramic on the hardwood floor. Hovering above my east field, maybe a half-mile out, was a massive object. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, I could make out its circular shape, easily the size of a football field, with strange protrusions and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I watched. The blue-green light emanated from its underside, casting my entire 80-acre wheat field in an eerie glow that made the young shoots look alien themselves. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my breath fogging the window. "I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. My feet are planted as firmly in the soil as the oak trees lining my property. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't anything built by human hands. The craft, because what else could you call it, was silent, utterly silent, despite its enormous size. It simply hung there, defying gravity, illuminating my field with that strange light. My border collie Rusty began to howl from a mudroom, a sound I'd never heard him make before, half warning, half fear. The chickens in the nearby coop started a frantic clucking that quickly rose to a panic pitch. Even the cattle in the distant pasture, barely visible in the strange light, began to low nervously. The animals knew, maybe they understood better than I did, that nothing in our world should look like that, move like that, or hang in the air like that. I forced myself to think practically. Phone. I needed to call someone, the sheriff, the neighbors, hell, the military if I could figure out how to reach them. My cell was on the counter, and I grabbed it with still shaking hands. No signal, not even a single bar. The landline was dead too, just a hollow silence when I put the receiver to my ear. Out of options for outside communication, I did what any farmer would do when facing an unknown threat to their land. I prepared to investigate it myself. The shotgun cabinet in the hall held my Remington 870, a practical tool for farm life rather than any paranoid preparation for doomsday. I loaded it methodically, the familiar routine steadying my hands, then pulled on my jacket and work boots. Rusty was still howling, scratching frantically at the mudroom door. Against my better judgment, I let him out. He shot past me, hackles raised, but instead of running toward the strange craft, he pressed himself against my legs, trembling. Rusty wasn't a coward. I'd seen him face down coyotes twice his size without flinching. But whatever was happening terrified him at some primal level. "It's okay, boy," I said, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Stay close." I stepped onto the porch, Rusty glued to my side. The normal sounds of early morning, birdsong, distant traffic on the county road, the gentle rustle of wind through the pines that gave the farm its name, were all absent. The world felt muffled, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over everything except for that humming craft with its pulsing lights. The eastern horizon should have been lightening with dawn by now, but the sky remained dark, stars still visible except where they were blocked by the massive object. As I watched transfixed, smaller lights detached from the main craft, 7 of them, descending slowly toward my wheat field. I should have gone back inside. I should have barricaded the doors, hidden in the storm cellar, done anything except what I did next. But curiosity and a stubborn sense of ownership pushed me forward. This was my land, my responsibility. I needed to see. Rusty whined as I stepped off the porch, but followed loyally as I made my way around the barn toward the east field. The smaller lights had touched down among my newly sprouted wheat, arranged in what appeared to be a perfect geometric pattern around a central point. From each light, figures emerged, tall, slender figures that moved with a fluid grace that immediately struck me as wrong. I crouched behind my ancient John Deere tractor, peering around its massive tire. At this distance, maybe 300 yards, details were difficult to make out, but what I could see chilled me to the bone. The visitors stood at least 7 feet tall, with limbs too long and too jointed to be human. Their movements reminded me of praying mantises, precise, deliberate, and utterly alien. They appeared to be collecting samples, soil, plants, even insects, placing them in containers that glowed with the same blue-green light as their craft. One carried what looked like a scanning device, sweeping it in wide arcs that caused the wheat to momentarily flatten before springing back upright. I might have stayed there, frozen in horrified fascination, if not for what happened next. One of the creatures turned sharply, its elongated head swiveling in my direction with impossible speed. Even at this distance, I felt its awareness lock onto me like a physical touch. It raised one limb, pointing directly at my hiding place, and made a sound, a high, warbling trill that carried effortlessly across the field. The others immediately stopped their activities and turned in unison. 7 faceless figures, standing unnaturally still, all focused on where I crouched with my now whimpering dog and suddenly useless shotgun. "Run," I whispered to Rusty, my voice barely audible. But he understood, and we both bolted toward the barn. I heard no pursuit, no sound at all except our own panic movement, but somehow that was worse. I risked a glance back as we reached the barn door and saw the creatures walking toward us with that same measured, unhurried pace. They moved in perfect formation, maintaining exact distances from each other, more like programmed machines than living beings. Inside the barn, I slammed the heavy wooden door and shot the bolt home, knowing even as I did so that it was an empty gesture. If these things could cross interstellar space, what was a wooden door to them? Still, the familiar action calmed me enough to think. The barn's back exit led to the north field, then to the wooded area that separated my property from the Henderson place. If I could reach Doug Henderson's farm, maybe their communications were still working. Maybe they hadn't yet been visited. I had just decided on this course of action when Rusty's growl alerted me to a new threat. The barn door wasn't moving, but a strange distortion appeared in the center of it, as if the wood itself was becoming fluid. A long, segmented limb pushed through this rippling distortion, followed by another, and then the elongated head of one of the creatures began to emerge. They could phase through solid matter. The realization hit me like a physical blow. No wonder they hadn't bothered to pursue us, doors, walls. Likely even my shotgun's buckshot would be meaningless to them. I didn't wait to see more. Grabbing Rusty's collar, I pulled him toward the back of the barn, weaving between stacked hay bales and farm equipment. Behind us, I heard that same trilling sound, now clearly a form of communication as it was answered by similar calls from outside. They were coordinating, boxing us in. The back door was only 20 feet away when a figure stepped through the wall, directly in front of us. Sliding through the solid barn would like it was merely a projection. This close, I could see details I immediately wished I hadn't. The jointed limbs had bent in too many places, the smooth, featureless area where a face should be, the strangely iridescent quality of what passed for its skin, shifting colors like oil on water. Rusty snarled, bravely placing himself between me and the creature. The alien cocked his head at the dog, a gesture so oddly human it momentarily disarmed me. Then it raised what I now saw was a tool of some kind, pointing it at Rusty. "No," I shouted, raising my shotgun instinctively. Everything happened at once. I fired. The shotgun's roar deafening in the enclosed space. Rusty lunged. The creature made a sound like glass breaking, and a pulse of energy shot from its device, catching Rusty mid-leap. My loyal dog, companion of 12 years, froze in midair before dropping heavily to the barn floor. Not dead, I could see his chest still moving, but completely paralyzed. The buckshot had passed through the creature as if it were smoke, leaving a pattern of holes in the barn wall behind it. The being looked down at its chest where the shot should have torn through, then back at me, its featureless head somehow still managing to convey what I can only describe as contempt. It raised its device again, this time pointing at me. I threw myself sideways as another pulse of energy shot past, leaving a strange distortion in the air where I had been standing. My shoulder hit a support beam, sending pain shooting down my arm, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled behind my old combine harvester, mind racing. They could phase through matter, but were still choosing to use doors and pathways. They had weapons that could paralyze, but were taking the time to collect samples and scan rather than simply attacking. These details suggested purpose, methodology. They weren't here to indiscriminately destroy. They were studying, cataloging, exploring. And right now, I was just another specimen to examine. 2 more creatures entered through the walls, joining the first. They moved with that same terrible coordination, spreading out to surround my position. I was trapped. Then my gaze fell on the diesel fuel tank for the harvester. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. I unscrewed the cap as quietly as possible, then tore a strip from my shirt, stuffing most of it into the tank and leaving a tail hanging out. The creatures were closing in, moving with deliberate precision. They could have rushed me, but were instead tightening their formation methodically, cutting off escape routes. Their confidence would be their mistake. I fumbled in my pocket for my lighter, a simple Zippo I've carried for decades. The familiar weight of it in my palm was reassuring, a small piece of normal human technology in the face of something so utterly beyond our understanding. As the nearest creature rounded the corner of the harvester, I flicked the lighter and touched it to the makeshift fuse. The cloth caught immediately, fire racing toward the fuel tank. I didn't wait to see the result, already diving for the small maintenance hatch at the back of the barn that even my own farmhands didn't know about. The explosion wasn't as dramatic as in the movies. No massive fireball, no earth-shattering boom. But the pressure wave was enough to throw me forward through the hatch, tumbling onto the ground outside. Behind me, flames began to spread through the dry hay and ancient timbers of the barn. I didn't look back to see if the creatures had been affected. I simply ran, keeping low, heading for the tree line that would provide some cover on my way to the Henderson place. The physical exertion felt good, grounding me in the familiar mechanics of my own body after witnessing things that defied physical laws as I understood them. The woods were unusually quiet, no birdsong or rustling of small animals. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. Whatever influence these visitors wielded, it extended to all living things. I paused at the edge of the tree line, breathing hard, and looked back toward my farm. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching into the still dark sky. Beyond it, the massive craft continued to hover over my wheat field, its blue-green light now competing with the orange glow of the fire. But what made my blood run cold was the sight of my house. Even from this distance, I could see figures moving through it, more of the creatures, phasing in and out of walls, examining everything with that same methodical precision. One emerged onto the porch holding what was clearly my laptop, another with what looked like photo albums and papers for my office. They were gathering information, learning, studying. With a heavy heart, I turned away from the sight of my violated home and continued through the woods. The Henderson farm was my best hope now, though that hope was thin at best. If these creatures were at my place, they were likely everywhere. The walk through the woods normally took 20 minutes at a steady pace. I made it in 10, driven by a fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. As I approached the edge of the tree line, the Henderson place came into view across an open pasture. My heart sank. Doug's farmhouse was dark, no lights, no movement. Worse, another of the alien craft hovered above it, smaller than the one at my farm, but unmistakable, with that same blue-green illumination. The Hendersons' dairy barn had been partially disassembled, sections of wall and roof carefully removed and suspended in mid-air as creatures examined the structure. I couldn't see Doug or his family, and I didn't want to consider what that might mean. Backtracking into the woods, I tried to think. My farm was compromised. The Hendersons, too. The nearest town, Pleasant Valley, was 5 miles to the south, but given what I'd seen, I had little hope it had been spared. These things were organized, methodical. This wasn't a random landing, it was a coordinated operation. As the full implications hit me, I found myself sinking to the ground, back against a sturdy oak. If what was happening at my farm and the Hendersons was happening everywhere. This wasn't just an incident. It was an invasion. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to process the unimaginable. The eastern sky finally began to lighten with dawn, though the usual colors were muted by the strange atmospheric effect of the alien craft. It was in this half-light that I spotted the deer, a young doe picking her way carefully through the underbrush about 50 yards away. She moved with the heightened alertness of prey in dangerous territory, stopping frequently to test the air. When she suddenly froze, ears forward, I followed her gaze and saw one of the creatures at the edge of the woods, scanning the area with its device. The doe bolted, startling even me with her sudden movement. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and it raised its tool. A pulse of energy shot out, but the doe was already gone, bounding deeper into the woods with a speed and randomness the alien seemed unable to track. Something clicked in my mind. The creatures moved methodically, predictably. Their technology was advanced beyond imagination, but their behavior was almost mechanical, precise patterns, coordinated movements, predictable responses. But the doe's erratic flight had confused it, its scanning device sweeping empty air where she had already vacated. Maybe that was the key. Not confrontation. They could phase through matter and had weapons beyond my understanding, but unpredictability. Human chaos against alien order. With new purpose, I began to move through the woods, deliberately taking random paths, doubling back, changing direction without reason. I was heading generally south toward town, but never in a straight line, never establishing a pattern that could be predicted or analyzed. The sun was fully up by the time I caught my first glimpse of Pleasant Valley through a break in the trees. My cautious optimism died instantly. The small town of 1,200 people was in chaos. More of the alien craft hovered above it, at least for that I could see. Strange structures were being assembled in the town square, geometrically complex towers that pulsed with that same blue-green energy. People ran through the streets, some alone, others in groups, pursued by the creatures whose movements now seemed almost leisurely, as if the outcome was inevitable. Cars sat abandoned. Some crashed into storefronts or telephone poles. The water tower that had proudly displayed the town's name for generations had been partially deconstructed, sections of it suspended in mid-air as they were examined. I was witnessing the systematic dismantling and study of human civilization, conducted with the dispassionate thoroughness of scientists examining an anthill. A noise behind me broke my horrified trance, the snapping of a twig underfoot. I whirled, expecting to see one of the creatures, but instead found myself facing Sheriff Dan Payton, his service pistol pointed squarely at my chest. Holcomb, he lowered the gun slightly, recognition and relief washing over his haggard face. "Thank God. I thought you were one of them." Dan looked terrible. His uniform was torn and dirty, his normally clean-shaven face stubbled with gray, and a nasty cut above his eye had left a trail of dried blood down the side of his face. "They're everywhere," he continued, holstering his weapon. "Hit the whole county, as far as I can tell. Maybe the whole damn state." Radio communications went out around 3 a.m. By 4, those things were landing. We tried to organize at the station, get people to safety, but... He trailed off, gesturing hopelessly toward the town. "What about your family?" I asked, thinking of Dan's wife and teenage daughters. His face hardened. Ellen got the girls out. They were heading for her sister's place in the mountains. No electricity there, remote. Hoping they... He couldn't finish the thought. "Have you seen anyone else from out my way?" I asked, thinking of Doug Henderson and his family. Dan shook his head. "You're the first. Been moving through the woods since they took the station. Those things, they can walk through walls, Ev. Bullets don't touch them. What the hell are we supposed to do against that?" I shared what I'd observed about their methodical movements, their apparent confusion when faced with unpredictable behavior. Dan listened intently, the trained law enforcement officer evaluating tactical information. "Makes sense," he nodded. "They had us pinned down at the station, moving in that perfect formation you described." Jenkins panicked, started firing wildly, running in circles, screaming. I thought he'd lost his mind, but the aliens couldn't track him effectively. Created enough confusion for some of us to slip out the back. "What happened to Jenkins?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "One of them adapted, did something with that scanning tool. Jenkins just froze mid-step. They took him, carried him to one of their ships." Dan's voice was flat, the emotion carefully controlled. "They're learning, Ev. Getting better at predicting what we'll do." That was a chilling thought. If they could adapt, our advantage of unpredictability might be temporary at best. "We need to find others," I said, thinking aloud. "People who got away, like us. Form some kind of resistance, figure out what these things want and how to fight them." Dan nodded grimly. I was heading for Miller's Cave. Natural formation, deep in the hills. No technology, nothing to attract their attention. A few of us agreed to regroup there if things went south. It was as good a plan as any. Miller's Cave was about 8 miles southeast, a local landmark known for its extensive natural chambers. Crucially, it was isolated, far from any human technology that might draw the aliens' attention. We set off together, maintaining the random, unpredictable movement pattern that had served us well so far. As we traveled, Dan filled me in on what little he knew. The invasion, if that's what it was, seemed to have begun simultaneously across at least the Midwest. His last radio contact with the state police suggested similar craft appearing over Lincoln, Omaha, and as far east as Des Moines. "They're targeting infrastructure first," he explained as we paused to rest in a dry creek. "Power stations, water treatment, communications towers. But they're not destroying anything. They're studying it, taking pieces, like they're trying to understand how it all works." "I saw the same at my place," I confirmed. "They took my laptop, papers, photos. Like they're cataloging everything." Dan's expression darkened. "That's not all they're taking, Ev. They're abducting people too. Systematically. First responders, utility workers, people who understand how these systems function. We got reports of them targeting hospitals, taking doctors and medical equipment. The implications were disturbing. They want to understand us, how we live, how our society functions." "Why?" Dan voiced the question we were both thinking. If they have the technology to cross space, phase through matter, what could they possibly need from us? I had no answer. The aliens' motives remained as inscrutable as their featureless faces. By mid-afternoon, we were within 2 miles of Miller's Cave when we saw another craft, this one moving slowly over the forest canopy, scanning methodically. We pressed ourselves against the earth behind fallen logs, barely daring to breathe as the massive object passed overhead. The forest below, it responded strangely to its presence. Leaves curled inward as if touched by frost, despite the mild spring air. A flock of birds erupted from the trees, flying in chaotic patterns before dropping back into the canopy, as if suddenly robbed of the energy or will to continue. "They're affecting living things," I whispered to Dan once the craft had moved on. "The animals on my farm knew something was wrong before I did." "People too," Dan added. "In town, I saw folks just give up. Stop running, stop fighting, like their will was drained out of them. Others went crazy, violent, usually the ones who fought hardest at first." I thought of Rusty, loyally trying to protect me despite his obvious terror. He'd sensed the wrongness of the creatures at a level I couldn't access with my human perceptions. I could only hope he'd recovered from the paralysis and escaped the burning barn. We reached Miller's cave as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The cave entrance was hidden in a rocky outcropping, unremarkable unless you knew what to look for. Dan led the way, moving with the caution of someone who expected an ambush. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately, the cool dampness a relief after hours of tense travel. Dan produced a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal the cave's main chamber, about 30 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to cathedral height in the center. We weren't alone. Shapes moved at the edges of the flashlight beam, then resolved into people-drawn, frightened faces that showed momentary alarm before recognition set in. "Sheriff," a voice called. Doug Henderson stepped into the light, his weathered farmer's face a welcome sight. "Everett?" "Thank God." There were 11 people in the cave, a motley assortment of Pleasant Valley residents who had managed to escape the initial chaos. Doug and his wife Marion, Doc Porter from the town's only medical clinic, Hannah Wilcox, who ran the hardware store, the Peterson family, father, mother, teenage son. 3 others I recognized but didn't know well. Each had a story similar to ours. Strange electrical disturbances preceding the arrival of the craft. The methodical exploration and dismantling of human structures and technology. The creature's ability to phase through solid matter, rendering conventional defenses useless. "They took Susan and the girls," Doug said quietly, speaking of his daughters, "right through the bedroom wall while we were planning to evacuate. Didn't even have time to scream. I got Marion out through the storm cellar, but..." He trailed off, the guilt of survival heavy in his voice. Similar stories emerged from the others. Loved ones taken, homes invaded, the ordered structure of rural life completely upended in a matter of hours. Through it all, I noticed a pattern. The aliens seemed particularly interested in children, the elderly, and anyone with specialized knowledge or skills. "They're categorizing us," Doc Porter suggested, his academic mind trying to make sense of the chaos. "Taking samples of different demographics, different expertise, creating a human catalog." "But why?" Hannah demanded, the practical hardware store owner wanting concrete answers. "What do they want with us?" No one had a satisfactory answer. We were trying to understand the motives of beings so different from ourselves that even their physical form defied our comprehension. As darkness fell outside, we took stock of our resources. Between us, we had 3 firearms with limited ammunition, a variety of tools, some food and water, first aid supplies, and most importantly, local knowledge of the terrain that the aliens couldn't possibly possess yet. "We need information," Dan said, naturally taking a leadership role. "We need to understand what they're doing, what they want, what might hurt them." "They have a pattern," I added, sharing my observations about their methodical movements and apparent confusion when faced with chaos. "They're extremely organized, almost mechanical in their precision. That gives us a small advantage if we can be unpredictable." "But they learn quickly," Doug countered. "I saw one of them adapt its movements after my neighbor's hunting dog charged it. Started moving more erratically itself." This matched what Dan had said earlier about Jenkins. The aliens could analyze and adapt to our behaviors. Our window of advantage might be narrow. We formulated a simple plan. Rest through the night, then send out small reconnaissance teams at dawn to gather more information about the aliens' activities and maybe scavenge additional supplies. The cave would serve as our base of operations until we could determine our next move. As the others settled in to rest, I found myself too wired for sleep. I wandered deeper into the cave, following a narrow passage that opened into a smaller chamber. The sound of dripping water echoed softly off the stone walls, a natural rhythm that felt comforting after the alien precision I'd witnessed all day. I sat on a smooth boulder, listening to the dripping water and trying to process everything that had happened. In less than 12 hours, my entire world had been upended. My farm, my livelihood, possibly even my faithful dog, all gone or irrevocably changed. The familiar rhythms of planting and harvesting, the predictable cycles of rural life, had been shattered by beings that defied comprehension. Can't sleep either? Doc Porter's voice came from the passage entrance. The elderly veterinarian made his way carefully into the chamber, his flashlight beam bobbing with each step. Too much to process, I admitted. He nodded, settling his aged frame onto another boulder. In 50 years of veterinary practice, I've learned that all living things follow patterns. Seasons, migrations, reproduction, disease, all cyclical, all predictable, if you know what to look for. He paused, the flashlight casting deep shadows across his lined face. But this is outside any pattern I understand. Do you think they're here to exterminate us? I asked bluntly, voicing the fear that had been growing in my mind. Porter considered this carefully. No, he said finally. If that were their goal, they could have done it already. Their technology is clearly capable of it. This is something else. Study, categorization, perhaps even collection. Like a cosmic zoo, the thought was almost more disturbing than extinction. Or a museum, Porter suggested, preserving examples of Earth life and civilization before. He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. We sat in silence for a long time, the steady drip of water marking the passage of time in this underground sanctuary, while above us, beings from beyond our world continued their mysterious work. Whatever they want, Porter said eventually, we can't give up. Adaptation is the key to survival. Every species I've ever studied survives through adaptation. Even if we can't match their technology, we can adapt our behavior, our thinking, find a way to persist. His words struck a chord. As a farmer, I understood adaptation intimately, changing planting strategies for unusual weather patterns, adopting new techniques when old ones failed, adapting to market fluctuations, equipment breakdowns, pest invasions. It was the fundamental skill of agriculture, reading the signs, adjusting your approach, surviving to plant again next season. We'll adapt, I agreed, finding unexpected strength in the familiar concept. We'll observe, learn, and adapt. Porter nodded, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. That's the farmer in you talking. Good. We'll need that perspective. When we returned to the main chamber, I found Dan studying a rough map someone had sketched on a flat stone using charcoal. It showed Pleasant Valley and the surrounding area, with X marks indicating alien craft sightings. Thinking about tomorrow's recon, I asked, crouching beside him. Trying to identify patterns, he replied, his sheriff's training evident in the systematic approach. They seem to be establishing a perimeter around the town, with concentrated activity at key infrastructure points. If we're going to observe them safely, we need to find the gaps in their coverage. I studied the crude map, my farmers noting something interesting. They're avoiding the reservoir, I pointed out. The large man-made lake that supplied the town's water showed no X marks near it. And the old quarry, too. Dan frowned. You're right. Why would they avoid those? Water, Doc Porter suggested, joining our impromptu strategy session. Everything we've seen suggests they can phase through solid matter, but perhaps water is different. It's fluid, constantly moving, difficult to maintain cohesion through. The quarry is partially flooded now, remember. It was a theory worth considering. If the aliens had limitations, understanding them would be crucial to our survival. Outside the cave, night had fully fallen. Through the narrow entrance, I could see stars, normal, familiar stars, seemingly unaffected by the otherworldly presence that had so thoroughly disrupted our lives on the ground. The constellations I'd used to mark the seasons and guide planting decisions since childhood continued their eternal patterns. indifferent to the alien craft now moving beneath them. Somewhere up there was the visitor's home, a world so different from ours that its inhabitants could phase through our solid matter, a place that had produced beings and technology beyond our comprehension. And yet, they had come here to our small corner of Nebraska, for reasons we could only guess at. As I finally settled down to try to sleep, my thoughts returned to my farm. The wheat would continue growing whether I was there to tend it or not. The natural cycles would proceed. Spring would yield to summer, summer to fall, regardless of whether humans or aliens observed the transition. That thought was strangely comforting. Whatever happened, the earth would adapt. Life would continue in some form. And as long as we held onto our humanity, our capacity for adaptation, for chaos, for the unpredictable spark that made us who we were, we too might find a way to survive in this new reality. 12 hours earlier, I had been a simple farmer beginning his day, concerned with weather patterns and equipment maintenance. Now I was a survivor of humanity's first contact with alien life, hiding in a cave and planning resistance against incomprehensible beings. But the core of who I was remained unchanged, a man connected to the land, to cycles of growth and harvest, to the fundamental patterns of life on Earth. If there was hope for humanity, perhaps it lay in that connection, the understanding that even in the face of technology that made our greatest achievements look primitive, we possessed something the methodical aliens might not, a deep, intuitive bond with our world and its natural rhythms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new observations, new adaptations. But for tonight, in the darkness of Miller's Cave, surrounded by other survivors, I allowed myself a moment of cautious hope. The aliens might have superior technology, but we had fought for survival against droughts, floods, economic collapse, and disease for generations. Persistence was in our DNA. I am Everett Holcomb, third-generation farmer from Nebraska, and I survived the first 12 hours of the alien invasion.